Yes, thank you. As Rod mentioned, this conference started back in 1997, and I started it back then because in those days I produced policy guidance documents for the International Agency on coal use and so on. And back then, if you wanted information, Google didn't exist. I mean, I am that old. If you wanted information, you went to a physical library, you borrowed some journals, you looked through the reference sections, you found something relevant. You then went through their citations to try and reverse engineer where this information was coming from. You looked for physical printouts of where conferences and meetings may be happening. You phoned people, you wrote letters in longhand. We're talking about real old school. And so my boss said, it normally takes 10 months to a year to produce this amount of information. Why don't you get everybody just to come to you and tell you what they know? So we ran this meeting at the National Physical Laboratory in London, and I think we had about 60, 70 people there. It went really well, so we did it the next year I think we did it at Warwick University, and then we did it again, and Dave Curtis came in to help with the Source Testing Association, and at that point my boss realized I was having far too much fun at these meetings, so he said I couldn't continue to run them, but I could continue to attend. And at that point David and Marcus came in and took over, and I'm just so delighted at the strength they've taken it there. It's incredible. So I officially retire on Tuesday next week. Yes! So having been old school from the beginning, I went new school and I got AI to help me with this. So some of this may be right and some of it may not be right. So apparently the first ever pollution laws went back to the Roman courts, where people were sitting about complaining because Nigel next door had his fire on too high or whatever, but they were actually seeking some sort of policy intervention on that, even back then. And Emperor Justinian, I think it was 547 or 549, where he declared that clean air was a human right, and we're still fighting for that now, unfortunately. And in 1306, King Edward I declared that anyone burning sea coal where he could see or smell it was to be beheaded instantly. So policy was there, but not necessarily enacted fully, thank goodness. So a lot of men getting angry about pollution. So thankfully, Professor Ringelmann came up with the first kind of monitoring of air pollution back in the day, and he produced the Ringelmann charts, the Method 9, where you saw how dark the particulate cloud was that was coming towards you. Now, first of all, he would just tell you how to make your own charts. He would tell you how to draw them. It wasn't until about 10 years later that he actually bothered to print them out so that everybody had a standardized format. But basically, you could go out in your garden and say, Nigel next door definitely has his fire up too high. So it was very, very old school. And then we started to get the chicks involved in the science. And I asked AI to show me the canaries in a coal mine. So it came up with this first image of this poor dead canary in a coal mine. And I said, well, that's fair enough, but it could be down a hole. Show me that it's actually in a coal mine. So AI came up with these 4 miners looking very grim at the funeral of this canary in a coal mine. And I said, it's very dark, make it brighter. So we now have a luminous canary, and I don't know if you can see, but the miners look ecstatic at the death of this canary. It's very bright. So anyway, back in those days, that's how it was. You would put a canary down a coal mine, and if it died, then something was wrong with the air. You know, not enough carbon, not enough of the good stuff, not enough of the oxygen, probably a lot of carbon monoxide and so on. And then we got the dogs involved. I don't know if you've heard about the sniffer dogs. They have them in Minnesota. I think they started them out in Denmark and Sweden, where they were more concerned about mercury than anywhere else. And these sniffer dogs can actually sniff mercury. Now, mercury, as far as I know, is an atom. For a dog to be able to detect that is huge. But they send these sniffer dogs into these old labs and these old high schools, and they can find out where the mercury is trapped in these downpipes and collection tubes. And this Clancy guy, he's got 2,000 pounds he's found, and an average of just under a kilogram per site. Now, that sounds horrific, but mercury's quite heavy. But at the same time, I went to school in these days. We did play with mercury thermometers. We did break them on purpose, because that was fun. And you got to flick it at your friend, and then the teacher would eventually scoop it all up and flush it down the drain, and it stayed there for Clancy to find. So very old school and very basic, but we're still using old school these days. And we started to see the evolution of the monitors that we know today. In 1918, you see the first kind of chemical-based monitor where you get an indication of CO2 being there. And then in 1925, the first portable version where the AT&T workers that were running the telephone lines could take them down a hole in the ground with them, and it would warn them when the CO2 was too high. And then Germany got involved, and of course Germany do things extremely well. The Draeger tubes came, we see some kind of chemical reactions and a colorimetric response. And by 1946, the Japanese were actually grading it, so you got a sort of quantitative sort of supply. So things were improving significantly. And if we look at ozone, ozone started to get concerning back in 1955. I wasn't around then, but it was concerning for those people that were alive at that point. And it started out, the main concern was in California. They actually had a petrochemical plant that was producing large amounts of ozone and releasing it into the urban area. And I think on one day in 1955, it got up to 0.68 parts per million of ozone. And back in those days, the monitors were sort of bent bits of brittle plastic, and if the ozone was high enough, those would actually snap. So really quite basic and quite scary to think that if that's been bad enough for that to snap, then what on earth am I breathing in? So back in those days, the response was to make sure the traffic didn't come into town to make it worse. And they started to build their own monitoring network back in those days with chemiluminescence and these kind of things. And nowadays you can log on online and NASA is reporting live in real time the ozone that there was on the planet around us. Incredible advancements being made. So according to the AI, this is what I should be focusing on. The new targets. When I started out in the sort of 1990s, it was SOx, NOx, and particulates were what we were all concerned about. Those were basically the emission limits you were looking at. And then people started to get worried about mercury and get worried about boron and then worried about POPs. And now we're worried about PFAS. And as soon as you think you're on top of this, somebody comes up with something else for you to fret about. And at the same time, as we solve these problems, you've now got lower and lower concentrations of this to detect. And you're now putting it in many cases, in a storage case, and you have to make sure that it's not leaking out. So a lot of different approaches, a lot more.